this computer. Right. So, firstly, one of the striking things about your early career is that you collaborated on a play with the great Stephen Polikov. Was there anything about the young writer that made you think he would go on to being the formidable force in film and television which he is today? And how did this give you grounding in drama which you were able to build on throughout your career?
Well, there was everything to say he was going to go on to great things, because he was completely obsessive. Even then, he'd written a novel which I probably still even have a copy of, handwritten, when he was God knows how young, and he'd written other plays. He just worked so hard at it, and it just seemed that he would definitely, be going somewhere. But he wasn't that funny. And so I thought, when we decided to do this play together, it was like a satire. And I kind of felt, anyway, that my contribution was to get the laughs in, to make the characters a bit ridiculous, and to give it a nice edge. And then after that, we formed a youth theatre company, just putting on his plays, really. And we did a play called at some theatre club in Euston, which Christopher Hampton came to see and commend. And we did another one. I can't remember what the other one was. And then my first proper paid acting job was up at the Traverse in Edinburgh, doing a play by Stephen called A Day with My Sister. And I was the boyfriend. I wasn't the brother of the girl. I was the sort of idiot comedy turn who comes in halfway through. But yes, I learned a lot. I mean, he's still very, very driven, and works incredibly hard and has a huge output. He reminds me in that sense a bit of Ben Elton, except Ben Elton's got lots and lots of jokes, and Stephen doesn't have lots and lots of jokes. But the sort of method of what the output is astonishing. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Did you ever go in that direction yourself?
Did you ever want to go in that direction yourself?
Writing plays and things?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. I avoided it for years, maybe because of Stephen and Ben. I kind of thought that's what I'm not going to do. But about 20 years ago, I found myself in We Will Rock You, in a musical, and I thought I'm not going to have time to write another book. So I started writing plays, and I wrote my first play during that, and it got put on. It went into the West End briefly, called On the Sea, about the Sistine Chapel, about two plasterers who get fired by Michelangelo, and they sneak back into the Sistine Chapel to try and chip their bits off because they're so pissed off with him for being fired. And then I wrote a play about Robert Louis Stevenson, which went on to Finborough. And then I've written quite a few plays since then. I just had one on tour of farce this year in the north, in Northern Comedy Theatre, called All Above Board. And I had a one with a British Asian cast, British Asian family, based on a Marivaux farce called The Game of Love and Chance. I called it The Game of Love and Chai, and modernized it. It's 18th century comedy, and I modernized it to a modern London or Manchester family, British Asian family, Hollywood tunes and dancing in it. It was pretty cool. We did that at Tara Theatre. Jatinder Verma put it on
Oh.
at Tara, and it went on tour. And then eventually I wrote a play with Adrian Edmondson, and we took that on tour. It's called Vulcan 7. And we took that on tour, I can't, quite recently, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And we were just about to transfer that. We rewrote it, gave it a new title. It's Heading Straight Towards Us is the new title. And we were just did a reading of it without us acting the part. We got some proper actors. Sam West and Tony Gardner played the roles that we'd originally played. And they did such a good job of it. And it looked like we might be getting into the West End with that play. And then the lockdown happened. So we were a casualty of the lockdown, as a lot of plays were, you know. But so I did, in answer to the question, I eventually got around to it at the age of about 50. I got around to quite, taking playwriting pretty seriously, really, and had, made quite a few.
Yeah. So, second question. You arrived on the comedy scene right at the very beginning of the alternative comedy revolution. How did the socio-economic and political climate help with this subtle shift in entertainment?
Could you repeat the last bit? How did the what?
How did the socio-economic and political climate help with the subtle shift in entertainment?
That's an interesting question. Because I've often had the theory, there was a lot of Thatch, anti-Thatch, Ben Elton did a lot of Thatcher material. We used it as a joke in the air. Was how do you take that, Mrs. Thatcher? And there was a lot. We did a lot of the miners' strike gigs and etc. But I've always had a kind of pet theory that the alternative comedians were sort of shining examples of Thatcherism, because they sort of paradoxically, comedy before that was certain organized along certain lines, and then suddenly some completely independent people working independently of them, of anything, turn into success. And some of them made loads of money, became establishment figures, and sort of took over. So they were there's an irony there that somebody like comedian like Ben or like Sale would have not come full circle, but would have almost been an example to what they were supposedly fighting against in the first place. But I suppose revolution is ever thus, isn't it? Always how it happens.
This is what I want to him about
This is what you were talking about. Arthur Smith.
He said that no.
This is what he was talking to Andy Smith. Arthur. This is what he was talking to Arthur Smith about.
Yeah.
About how it all changed after.
is
And the people that wrote alternative comedy.
became part of the establishment.
Because the people that wrote alternative comedy became part of the establishment.
Yeah, quite quickly. Well, I feel, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was selling out or not. I mean, I'd like to have had the opportunity to sell out. Quite happy. You need sell out. You need to get, I suppose, to have something to sell and to pay.
Yeah.
You know, it's quite often hard to get paid, especially if you're writing plays.
That's right. Don Ward's Comedy Store is always cited as the birthplace of alternative comedy. How important was this in giving your generation a platform to hone your craft?
The Comedy Store was like the place, the beginning of it all. We'd all been doing, not just Rick and Dade and Peter Richardson and myself, Alexi Sale even, but also all the other people, Andy de la Tour, that there'd been a huge amount of new work happening for some years through the 70s in fringe theatre. That's where it had gone to, various fringe companies for about maybe even 10 years, but certainly 5 years. But when the Comedy Store opened, that seemed to be the magnet for all of those kind of fringe activities to come to the comedy and try and do comedy. So you had, although you had a lot of stand-up comedians, you also had a lot of, I suppose, what in those terms in cabaret would be called speciality acts, mime artists. And when Stuart Lee did his at last the 1982 show, whatever it was, a thing at the Festival Hall where he picked the ones he remembered from his childhood. He's a bit younger than me. He invited me and Alexi and people to come and play his what's it called, his mashup or whatever it's called. But there were people I'd forgotten. There was The Greatest Show on Legs, and they weren't stand-up comedians. They did a naked balloon dance. And there was that bloke, and I have forgotten his name, I'm sorry, who put fireworks up his arse. He put he lit fireworks up his behind. And there was Andrew Bailey, who was the sort of meek and mild, strange, almost like horror movie clown, who brought the briefcase on with him and played the harmonica. He was a bit spooky. There was a whole range of acts who weren't, strictly speaking, stand-up comedians, who did weird stuff, and the Comedy Store allowed all that spectrum of people, whole range, although not so good, has to be said, for women. That it was still a bit macho then. When we started the comic strip, shortly afterwards, we sort of splintered from it. We took Dawn and Jennifer, French and Saunders, on board. There was Pauline Melville. There were female comedians, but I think they had, a harder time. I don't think it was, I think there were stag nights out, like the culture nowadays, and they had a tough time. There was one night Alexi wasn't there for some reason, and a guest compere was needed. And there was a guy in the audience who was one of those comedians on the telly, had the curly permed hair and the sort of DJ type jacket, old school. And he came up and he was funny. He's a funny guy. Can't remember his name. And he did us a favor and did the comparing that. And one of the people on the show was a girl, was a woman, and his introduction to her was like just totally out of order, totally, you know. Oh, and we've got this act and that act and a woman, you know, like it was a sort of really. And then when she went off, she didn't do brilliantly, has to be said. But when she went off, he came back on and said, "Not very funny, but a damn good fuck." That was his sort of outro for, and that was, we were supposed to be the home of non-sexist, non-racist comedy. We had to be grateful to him because we didn't have a compare that night, and he was funny, but I think it was a transitional phase. Comedy Store, and then comic strip. We had Pauline Malvern, we had Paola Donizetti, Ruby Wax. You know, women's. It started to become more inviting, I think, and the audiences started to accept women. But in the early days of the Comedy Store, I think they were just growing out of that 1970s.
Yeah.
When I interviewed Paul
Jackson. When he interviewed Paul Jackson.
Oh yeah, yeah.
he said, look, when he went to the store,
He said that when he went to the Comedy Store.
there was reaction from money.
There was a negative reaction towards BBC. BBC management. Yeah.
Management or money?
Management.
Management. Yeah, yeah.
How do you think people like Paul Jackson help you get your platform?
How do you think people like Paul Jackson helped you get your platform?
Oh, completely. There was a reaction against all the, you know, big knobs coming in, the BBC, and strangely Americans. You know, anything that was American, it was like maybe nowadays you just reject. You know, you're trying to say that we're us and we don't want to have all those things. And the BBC, that's just there, you know, it's just on your shoulder. And yet, of course, when Paul Jackson did turn up, there was maybe one or two people who gave him the cough, or Tony Allen, maybe, who was who sort of alternative, you know, he was part of the underground press, you know, the magazine, It magazine, and you know, he was considered himself to have an alternative lifestyle even. But most of the comedians were swarming around Paul Jackson like bees to honey, you know. I mean, everybody was thinking, give us a job, you know. Can I be first? Choose me, you know. That was. They may have been saying, "Oh, BBC's shit," you know. They were crawling over broken glass to get on it. All of them, bar, as I say, one or two. Peter Richardson was not very impressed by the BBC. He wanted to do things his own way. He didn't. I mean, he and I differed on that. I was as creepy crawly as the rest of them to try and get a gig, you know, at the BBC. And there was a meeting that some of the BBC producers, script editors called Peter and me in, to say they thought we were the most likely to be comedy writers. Civilized was the civilizable. That was the word they used. Out of all the acts, you seemed to be the most civilizable. You could write material for the BBC, and Peter never turned up to the meeting. Probably wisely, I don't know. I went because I thought, great, I'd love to be writing for I'd love to be writing stuff for the BBC. But it wasn't to be. And Peter had his own plans.
What I find fascinating about your generation is that although there seemed to be a clear divide between the mainstream old school comedy and alternative comedy, however, in reality, there was much reverence from your generation towards traditional platforms. Therefore, I wondered, who were your comedy heroes growing up?
Growing up, I loved Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. I used to watch That Was the Week That Was and the Frost Report. So I'm quite old. I mean, I remember as well, not so much the Goons when it was on the radio initially, when it was the first time, because I'm not that old, but there was something called the Telegoons, which were little puppets of the Goons, which did old Goon scripts. And they Ned Seagoon, and they did all that. And I used to love that when I was, I suppose it must have been, 11, 12. Used to go around to a friend's house and watch that. And I remember his mum would make us tea and sandwiches, and we were allowed to watch that. We'd sit and watch the Goons on the way home from school.
In 1980, sorry.
Yeah, go on. No, carry on. I was just trying to think if there were any more that I admired when I was growing up. My taste matured. But
what about
Monty Python? Yeah, them too. Love that. I mean, when did they come out? 70? I can't remember when they came out. I mean, I was older during
76.
that. 76 was it? So I was already in my 20s by the time Monty Python came out.
Right, next one. In 1982, you secured the role of the Bohemian Neil in the surreal sitcom The Young Ones. What were your first impressions of the role, and how do you think The Young Ones helped to move the sitcom forward?
Well, I'd been playing that character Neil for about 5 or 6 years before the program. He comes from a show that I wrote with Pete Richins and Peter Richardson called Rank, which we'd taken on tour and we'd done at the Roundhouse, and then had become part of our act at the Comedy Store, Neil, and he had the guitar and the act, and the idea came to us after we'd worked with Paul Jackson on Boom Boom Out Go the Lights, and the BBC and other channels were coming to the comic strip and the Comedy Store wanting to develop television. And we felt that, particularly Rick and myself, felt that as stand-up comedians, even sketch comedians, wasn't where our strength was going to be. It was in character comedy. And so what we were looking around for was an idea where we could do wacky things, but in a sitcom, so that we could have a character. And my character, obviously, was the Neil character, who was part of the act. Rick's Vic, and Adrian's character would obviously be something like his dangerous brothers. And Peter's character, because it was to be Peter's, was to be, Peter used to play a photographer in our act, or anybody kind of cool and slick. He'd always play the guy who'd come in and go, "Give me a plane," and I mean one with a good movie on, or whatever. He'd be the cool guy. And so we were sort of pretty committed to the idea that what we were looking for is a sitcom that would also have room for sketches, as it were. And the first idea was a bit like that Beano house, where each of the acts would be in a different room in this house. And then working from that, Rick and Ben and Lisa Mayer came up with the idea, no, they're students, all the young ones, you can have sketches, and it's those characters living in a house in the Lexus van. And that's when the sitcom was actually born. That was the situation, because we hadn't quite got as far as situation before that point. And then they battled to get the BBC to take that on. But it did change. It changed the sitcom quite considerably. But I mean, it's a bit of a one-off as well. Because if you look at sitcoms now, they just carried on. It's a pity they don't do more audience ones these days. I really like those audience ones. Ben did a very good lecture about Save Sitcom, audience sitcom. What is there? There's Mrs. Brown's Boys, Miranda. There's Ben's one, the Shakespeare one. How many other ones have an audience anymore, where you can actually see the actors getting the laughs, timing it themselves rather than working the camera? I don't know. There's only those three I can think of off the top of my head.
The Young Ones was the first sitcom to integrate a variety segment to the fictional world it created. How difficult is to play out?
How difficult was it? What did you say?
How difficult was it to play out?
Do you mean play out to the audience?
Yeah.
Not difficult at all. That's what we've been doing in the clubs and on tours, and we were pretty used to audience control and that. It was great fun.
But how did you go from the drama element to the section?
How did you go from
The
drama, conception?
How easy was it between the drama and what else was going on?
How easy was it to switch between
The drama.
Yeah.
And whatever else was going on?
Wherever else was going on,
Like a band.
like a band.
Oh, I see. You don't mean the drama like in sort of the tragedy. You mean the story, like the drama story that was going on in the show. And then there's a band in your living room. Yeah, I just seemed, I don't know, never really thought. That just seemed like that was the thing that made it fun. was that you were busy doing your sort of your scene, and then you could say, "Oh no, the plot changed." You know, there's a bit at the end of Filthy Rich and Cat Flap, I think it was there, where the writing was pretty shaky, and at the end of one plot, Rick comes out and says, "There we are, we've solved the plot, and you didn't think we'd do it like that just by being stupid." And that's literally the way they resolve the plot. It just comes out and says, "There we are, we've solved it." And because it was the plot's leading nowhere, and things like that, to get away with stuff like that, and only Rick could, I think, pull that off. But, yeah, that was the fun, was sort of being real and not real at the same time.
The huge popularity of the Young Ones spawned a comic relief single with Cliff Richard. How difficult was it to maintain character whilst singing?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was a singer. I'm a singer, and then I'm in character. And actually, that is quite difficult. When I did a single of Hole in My Shoe as Neil, and what we found in the studio is that Neil has a specific voice. Like, you know, he's got that way, he's got a certain way of talking. And therefore you want to sing in his voice. And he probably doesn't sing 100% in tune, you know. And yet, if you're listening to a whole record and it's sung in a comedy voice and out of tune, comedy can ruin the music, and music can equally ruin the comedy. So when we were recording it, we tried it with me singing it, just me singing it well, and it sounded great, but it didn't sound like Neil. So we then tried it, right, okay, go 100% character. And it sounded 100% character, but you really wouldn't want to listen to it for 3 minutes because it was, and so it sounds silly, but that's actually getting it just between crap and good.
Yeah,
was actually quite difficult to do, and we did several takes where I'm thinking, right, okay, I'll sing it a quarter tone flat now, and it'll sound like it's more like Neil and things. It sounds pretentious, but there's a battle goes on between music and comedy always, and you've got to let one of them win one battle, then the other battle, and it's quite a delicate balance, because music's going to grab your feelings, and comedy is trying to always burst things, you know, it's trying to sort of surprise you or take the piss, really.
As a founding member of the iconic comic strip, looking back, how significant was Peter Richardson to your career?
Well, he was very significant. I met him a few years before that, and we wrote a show together with Pete Richards. We got an Arts Council grant. We put it on tour. I was at drama school, and I left drama school to be with our group, you know, with the group that Peter and I had formed. Neil came out of it. Lots of the characters who were in the comic strip came out of that show. And when we went to the Comedy Store, I didn't go on my own. We hadn't seen each other for a few years. I called up Peter and said, "Come on, I dare you. Let's go and do an act at this new place, the Comedy Store." And being he's also a sort of wheeler dealer producer, so it was him who took some of the acts from the Comedy Store, put them into the comic strip. Him who tried to get the deal with Channel 4, not always to everyone's delight, you know, because he used to acts alone a lot of the time. He doesn't necessarily consult anybody, but yeah, he was absolutely the driving force. I think behind the whole movement, really, even though didn't end up in the young ones, it was him who created us as a group, who went on to do the young ones, who could sort of put the glue in what the house style was. So I think he's very, very important.
What was your
What was your favourite episode?
Oh, what was my favourite episode? I've been asked that loads. I always think it's the last one, because I love it when there's a sense of sadness as well in comedies. I really like it when it's tearing you up as well as making you laugh. And that last episode is really pretty sad. You know, they've been thrown out. They've not done their exams. They're hopeless. There's no work for them. They're on their last legs, really. And instead of getting depressed, they hijack a bus and get all overexcited and optimistic. And there's something really just beautifully sad and funny at the same time. They're on that bus going, yeah, we're wide-bottomed anarchists, and you know they're going nowhere. It's going to crash, and then it does crash, actually crash completely over the side of a cliff. And there's a lovely sort of pathos in that episode. I love that.
In 1987, you reunited with the young ones for Filthy Rich and Cat Flap. How difficult was it to portray a new character when faced with the same cast of such a cult show?
Well, it wasn't difficult. I was working with Ben Elton on creating my character. I think I tried a bit too hard to say, look, I don't want to play I want to play a completely different character. And everything went into, I'm going to have a baldy and a comb over and a beard, and I'm going to have a different voice, and I'm going to have he mustn't be sympathetic, he's not a loser, etc. I think I worked too hard to try and say, look, I'm not just Neil, I can play another character. I'd have liked, I enjoyed doing that, though. I'd have liked to have gone on, but it turned into Bottom rather than Filthy Rich and Cat Flap. I think it was probably the right thing to do. There was also a sort of writer's problem in that Filthy Rich and Cat Flap was scripted by Ben again. And Ben had gone on, he'd moved on from it. His heart wasn't that much in it. And there's Rick and Aid was still a double act, and there wasn't any reason why they shouldn't be writing their own show, really. So that's what they did.
As a writer, you've written an extensive body of work, but in 1996, you teamed up with Robert Llewellyn to write Therapy and How to Avoid It, a guide for the purple. In the age before mental health awareness, what can people take from this, which might be some use?
Oh, well, yeah. It's actually quite a useful book and got commended by various psychiatrists. It's a comedy book, Therapy and How to Avoid It. And it was a satire on John Cleese's book, Families and How to Survive Them. So there was a lot of, books at the time, parks and how to play in them, and something and how to do something. The Therapy and How to Avoid It was a good joke, and it takes the place of a dialogue, takes the form of the dialogue between Robert and myself, like the John Cleese book does with him and Robin Skinner, actress Robin Skinner. And there's a sort of story in it too, but each chapter we describe a different kind of therapy because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what therapy is and what each different kind of therapy is, you know, between psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, dynamic, psychodynamic, or Reichian, or Kleinian, or Jungian, or Freudian. You know, there's a hell of a lot of confusion about, and there's no kind of guide to what you're getting into when you sign up to therapy. Which ones are on the national health? There's not much. There's not much of a guidebook on, you know, have you just signed up to somebody who believes it should be 5 times a week for 17 years? Or have you just signed up to somebody who says, I'll give you 5 sessions to sort yourself out, and if it's not working after 5 sessions, then forget it. And, you know, how much is it going to cost? And all of those sort of questions. And Robert and I set about weaving into our comedy dialogue all that information so that you'd come away from the book knowing more. You'd know what you were letting yourself into. And so it's quite, it's a funny story, funny book, but there's there's quite a lot of info in it.
To you have got the if you now.
Do you think you would have got a different reaction if you'd released it now?
Yeah, I think that people are much more accepted. It wasn't that accepted then. And we were sort of treading new ground with it, I think. I think people would understand how to use it now. Whereas then there was a certain amount of sort of confusion as to what we were talking about, it seemed.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to have the amazing opportunity to interview the legendary Galton and Simpson back in 2010. And I know that you starred alongside Paul Merton in 1997 for the Galton and Simpson Playhouse in an episode entitled I Told You It's Burt Reynolds. How daunting was it to reprise a role originally portrayed by Roy Barraclough?
It wasn't that daunting. What was difficult was really being honest, was sort of drumming up the enthusiasm. I mean, it was enjoyable, it was fun. Everybody in it was funny.
Yeah.
But it's like doing a cover of, you know, a cover song or a remake of a film, you know, one of those big films. You think, well, it is so well. They did it. These guys did this so well. Are we really? Is it? You know, do we have the right? And are we? We're not going to be as good as them. So why are we doing this? Is it the back of your mind? So you have a bit of sort of self-doubt about doing it, which you've got to brush out the way and get on and do it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was fine. I'm sure, but there's always that thought of why are we pretending to be Hancock? Why not look at Hancock? You know what I mean? It's a bit, and they'd probably say these were that maybe it was a script that's been lost. I mean, there is a point to that, I suppose. If the transmission has been lost, then there's a point to that. There's a point to it, but that's not necessarily. It still felt a bit. That it was missing something, even if it was a lost script or a never recorded script.
Did you make?
Did you ever make them? Did you ever meet them? Did you ever meet them?
Meet Galton Simpson? Yes, I did once at I can't even remember what the do was. Somebody like an evening with, either an evening with Connolly, or an evening with Ben Elton, or one of those sort of things. And I was just briefly introduced. Yeah.
Beyond comedy, people might be surprised to learn that you were in the original cast for the West End debut of Evita. How did this come about?
Just like normal, you hear there's an audition and you go and you audition and you get a recall and you have to, I mean, and it still works like that now. I've done lots of musicals since. I've done about 10 years in the West End since in musicals. And even at whatever level you're at, on the whole, you have to meet the American. Ones I've done have been mostly American backed. I suppose I had an advantage doing Evita in that I didn't know anything about musical theatre. It didn't really interest me. I go for the audition with my guitar and sing a song, a Robert Palmer song, strumming away. Everyone else has got their sheet music and they're all proper, musical projection singers. And I didn't know, I was not daunted. The person I was auditioning for was Hal Prince. It was my first job, was for Hal Prince. And in the musicals world, that's like God. He directed West Side Story, the original. He was the producer of, you name one of the really big shows, he's usually had a hand in it. He was behind sometimes, he was huge in musical theatre. But I didn't know that. So I didn't go into the audition in fear, particularly. I just thought, oh, well, it's another person to audition for. And so I sang my song and didn't have to put on airs. Because if you're auditioning for somebody very important, it does, put the willies up. It's scary.
Yeah.
This eventually led to a reunion with Ben Elton for the West End debut of We Will Rock You. As an actor, how different is it to transfer the words from a page to a TV studio or theatre?
Yeah, it's different. To TV, you can always go and do it again. On a theatre, you're building a whole evening's performance. So it's like a long distance run. All your training for it will be like, what am I going to eat? If you were doing a marathon, you've got to build up to it slowly. You've got to know that your system is going to be able to do it. And on telly and film, it's different. Your staying power has to be, for film, you've got to be, I'm going to have to be working 15-hour days or whatever, and I might not do anything 8 hours. So it's a different, your mind is in a completely different place, but also your body is. For the theatre, you've got to be sort of performance fit. So you've got to be trained up. You've got to know your whole part, and you're also aware you're listening to the audience all the time. If it's funny, particularly, you're listening out for that. There's people over on the left there, they like that. The next time there's one like that, I'll pong it over there. They don't like it. There's people there who don't like swear words. That. So, but these what do like swear words. Blocking all the time with an audience. Who's there? How can you make contact with them? And it gives you the energy. The energy is coming off them. But of course, a camera is a different thing.
Yeah.
So, and you can't. How do you time it with no audience? You know how to time it.
Better
Which do you like better?
Yeah, which do I like better? Well, these days I prefer the filming, but those are for sort of physical reasons. Because it's a lot of work to be going 8 times a week and maybe around the country, you know. But I am still a bit of a junkie for hearing laughter. So I like giving a talk, maybe. You know, I do give talks, or I'll, you know, so I still would crave that. I do really like it.
Yeah. Looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
Oh, I don't know. Just move on, keeping going. Really, that's about it. Not giving up.
Yeah.
Because it's. I mean, I'm still right now. I've got a book that I've written. It's a comedy adventure book, and I've decided I've put it on a crowdfunding publisher, and it's doing quite well. You see the percentage every day, and I'm on social media all the time trying to pledge to fund so that it'll be published, and that seems, you know, don't give up. It's like I've written the book already. I want people to read it. It's a time travel adventure story, where, unlike, you know, Doctor Who or whatever, most time travel stories you move in time and space because of the time space. In this, you just literally, through inherited memory, can travel in time as if you have like birds can fly south. They remember how to fly. You can remember how to be here 100 years ago. So you'll find yourself 100 years ago. So you've got to be careful which underground train you go on, because it might not have been built 100 years ago and you might be buried. It's called Jeremiah Born in Time. And it's about a guy who finds that he can do this, but he doesn't know why. And he's got to find out why. And it's to do with his mum, who actually is a fugitive from the future. And she's had him nowadays and brought him here to be safe, to where we are, to the 2019. Brought him there to be safe. Might not have been the best year. That's the year she chose. And she's run off again, but because she's in trouble in the future. He's inherited the ability, but she never told him, so he's quite confused. And it takes place mostly in 1910 in London. And it's on Unbound, and I'm plugging it as much as I can right now. That's you know, the answer to your question is I'm always most proud of the next thing I'm doing. You know, that's the game.
If you send me the link in the radio.
If you send the link, you put it in the write-up.
Oh, great. Yes, I will. I'll do that. Yeah.
Apart from time traveling, what's next for Nigel Planer?
It's really difficult to say that these days, because I'm in an episode of Diane Morgan's new series, Mandy. Did a little bit of that fun. I just did quite a nice big job, which would be on Netflix. But beyond that, nowadays you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement before you do the job. They don't want, because of social media, I don't want everybody saying, hey, I've just done this. Here's the plot. Here's the story. This is what I look like in it. And then they don't like the idea. You have to sign up. When you sign your contract, you have to say you're not going to tell anybody what it is. So I can't answer that question. Good though. I can tell you that's really good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for.
Oh no, thank you.
Um,
Really good. Is that it? Are we done then? Is that it?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Cheerio then.
When
I'll send you the link.
Send the link and he'll let you know when it's all done.
Yeah, I do. Okay, doke.
Hey,
Cheers then.
Thank you.